All right, everyone. So my name is Neville Farouk. We'll be going through Splunk's Security Operations Suite. It's a very hands-on workshop today. Who here has done a Splunk workshop before, just so I can get an idea? Okay, so we have a new audience. That's good. It's very hands-on, so it's going to be interactive. In a few minutes, I'll actually have you go through your instances. We'll give you access to some different environments. But before that, I'll give a little bit of an introduction of myself and some of the Splunk's technology around security. If you have any questions, you can interrupt me. This workshop's going to be very interactive, so it's not super formal. Just stop me. If you have a question, raise your hand or just spit out some words. No worries there. So at Splunk, we do what we call Who Am I slides. If you're not familiar with Splunk, it is a data company, so we hold a lot of data in our platform. So we do our hashtag Who Am I slides with a bunch of data points. So a little bit of my background. I've been with Splunk since October 2021. I'm a solutions engineer here. I mainly support our Army customers. Before coming into here, most of my background was in security. I really have done security most of my career. I was with Lockheed Space coming into here. I was supporting them.
Yeah, so I'm Josh Broadbent. I am the Regional Vice President of
internal side with Lockheed Martin Space, and I was also doing some
I'm
stuff
not
on
going
the
to embarrass
DoD
myself
side
and ask how
along
many
with
of you
IC.
have heard of Beyond Trust Software.
Sorry, that's happening.
I have been doing this now for
so before
years.
that, I was with Deloitte, did some consulting work there.
In
A lot of my
12,
background is
was
around
really young to do that. I
DevSecOps,
didn't know that at the
trending
time. I just knew I didn't want to mow yards, and I still needed to make
security
money.
space, so shifting security to the left.
I am from just outside of Memphis, Tennessee, the Arkansas side, so I am a Razorback fan, for those of you who are not wondering, because nobody cares. I am married. I have 4 kids. One of my favorite things to say is I have 1 kid and 3 spares. So if any of you need an extra, I am absolutely happy to lend the middle one
most of the security stuff will be going through security hands-on products today. I'm also an alumni from Virginia Tech, working on a master's at Georgia Tech right now in computer science. I love sports, so if you can think of any fun sports things you want to talk about me throughout this conference, please let me know. So let's talk a little bit about our agenda here. I will be walking through the different aspects of our different security products. So I'll set the scene of what you'll be doing as an analyst. So this is designed for SOC analysts for the most part. There's definitely different takeaways you can get from different roles as well. But we'll go through the different examples. So we'll be in AWS. We'll be using some of the data coming into from specific environments from a threat hunting perspective, and go from there. So Splunk, of course, can be on-prem or in the cloud. So on here you'll see different examples, right? Our platform is holding the data first. That's the core of the technology. And then we have our different products, which we like to call our security products analytics driven. So when we talk about security operations in our SIEM solution around enterprise security, we're really doing an analytics-based approach. So we're running consecutive searches to get different user behavior analytics. We're running different searches for detections in our SIEM solution and different things like our machine learning toolkit, And then here we'll be touching on Phantom, which is now called SOAR. That's our orchestration tool where you can automate a lot of stuff. When I used to do this more hands-on, there was a lot of more Python writing, so I'll show you the different examples of how we can write some custom functions in Python, and how we can save a lot of time on some of the tasks that we had to do manually before. So these are just some of the areas that can be brought together as far as functions, right? In a security operations suite environment, I mentioned SOAR, so automating a lot of manual tasks that were being done before, going in and investigating from an analyst perspective. Now, when we talk about all those functions on the last screen, all these products do a little bit of that, right? As far as, you have user behavior analytics. That's going to be, hey, Neville has one entity in any system. He's going to be able to do this type of activity that will produce some type of threat to our security posture. Then you have Phantom. That's actually orchestrating different tools to be automated within an environment that a SOC analyst would have to do manually. Enterprise security is the full-blown SIEM, right? So a SOC analyst goes in, sees a lot of different investigations, has to take action, find a lot of different details within the environment, right? And that's all running on the machine platform. And now, enterprise security, I keep mentioning that. It is our SIEM solution, right, for incident event management. So here you see a lot of different incidents. We call them notables. All that's running on the back end on what's called enterprise security content updates. So that's what's actually being updated regularly with different detections. We have a whole team dedicated just to research that's updating this, bi-weekly at the minimum as far as detections for different types of threats. So now we got UBA. This environment, you'll be playing around with it, and you'll see a lot of names that, it looks like no one's really done any Splunk workshops yet, but there's a lot of familiar names to folks that have. And we brought in around 4 million events into this UBA environment to run these different analytics, essentially, right? So they're around the user and the behavior that's being done by each one. And really, it's getting different anomalies, different threats that could be generated, and UBA is then pushing into enterprise security. And again, this is Phantom. This is really doing the orchestration that I mentioned to you. And when I go through the actual hands-on exercises, I'll show you more of the features of how the different apps are being developed to use SOAR. And this would be, thinking of it high level, this is bringing in different events from Splunk Enterprise Security or a different SIEM solution, right? Palo Alto, any other SIEM, right? Sentinel, where it's actually being utilized to automate some stuff through what we call playbooks. And I'll touch more on that once we get to SOAR near the end of the workshop. So when it comes to our environment today, we're going to be seeing a lot of names. You're defending a company called Fraudly, which is essentially a brewing company. And it's based out of San Francisco. There's a lot of names on here. You don't need to memorize any of them, but you'll see these names again once we get into the different data sets. So just keep that in mind. When you start doing different workshops with Splunk, you're going to be using the same data sets because we run a bots event. I'm wearing a shirt, so if you see this later, bots is boss of the SOC, right? So it's our CTF event where we have our customers go in and try to play with the environment and answer different questions. And we use these same data sets to run these workshops. So as you start participating in these different events and workshops, you'll see some of the same data sets. You'll get familiar with some of the threats and things like that. So we're talking about Fraudly. That's our firm, right, that we're trying to defend. Last year they had a situation with Taedong Gang. That's an APT group. And our role is to actually investigate further into what happened there. And this is just some high-level detail around one of our new hires. You see Bud here. He's the head of IT. He clearly loves cloud. We're going to be working with some AWS stuff in a little bit. So just some fun stuff. Apparently he has no mouth, right? So Kevin Lagerfield is typically someone you've been working with at Fraudly if you're any associate, right? So you'll see that as we move into some of our examples and you do some exercises. So with this, Bud has taken Fraudly to the cloud, as I mentioned, so we'll have some AWS data. I think we'll have some Azure stuff as well when we're looking through the logs. And this whole glass table that we have here, it's available in Enterprise Security. If you kind of mess around, you go to glass tables, you can see this in the application itself. So all of us, what we're doing today, we're taking the role of Alice Bluebird. You're a SOC analyst, and your job is to investigate into what's happening with this recent issue with the APT. Now, this date, we'll be using it a lot, so just keep it in the back of your head around, when we're running some searches and stuff. We're going to be looking at a timeline because of what we're doing in this environment and what we're investigating. So this is a picture of a cool dog, but Alice decided to take the day off here and just hang out, and she's having lunch with her beloved dog here. So during lunch, she gets this call, which she decides not to pick up, which is not a good idea in this case, because a bit later, when she's at the Tiki bar, Grace is calling her. That's her CEO, and the news isn't good from the CEO at Fraudly. So Alice is a security analyst, right? So Alice runs into the office. She logs into Enterprise Security, sees these incidents, and wants to investigate what's next, right? And based on the threat intel that's been gathered already, it appears this APT that's called Tadon Gang is back at trying to hack fraudly, right, essentially. So other workshops we run, just for context, there's a lot going on with these different APTs from Tadon Gang specifically. And in this scenario of the workshop, they're just trying something new. So this time of the year, there appears to be two distinct campaigns. So one is going to be lager and one's going to be stout because they're a brewing company, right? So each APT is a separate entity, essentially. Is anyone familiar with the diamond model here? Okay, no worries. As you see on here, this was created by the FBI, actually, but it's just laying out the footprint of what this adversary can do, right? So this is Logger, for example, from the APT group. You can see their capabilities, PowerShell Empire. They can do some exploits around that, spear phishing. It's talking about who their victims could be, which is essentially just frothy, right? Because you see brewing companies there. And then you just see some stuff around the servers themselves and things like that. So just given you don't have to memorize any of this, just keep it in mind. And then here we have the other APT, of course, a similar adversary. They're a victim. Just more of their capabilities, right? So some of them are similar, but I mentioned earlier AWS. They're, of course, that nation-state APT. We're just seeing things around their time zones. So once we go into our logs, we're going to see some different times and things like that. We'll be making some adjustments to our searches. Okay, so with that kind of like introduction just of, Splunk from a security perspective, let's make sure everyone can log in and get their credentials. So an easy way to do this is, can anyone not access Google Drive here? Using a government computer or just personal. If you're able to access Google Drive, I recommend going to this link. I tried to make it a pretty short bit.ly link, so if you could just hit that drive, you'll see a few documents that I have here as well. You'll see a Google sheet that you all can actually edit and pick out your particular instance. And there's more than enough for everyone, so head on over to that G drive, and I'll give you all a minute or two to try to figure out if you're having any issues with the links and stuff, just let me know. I'm right here. Sorry? Yep, so these are both underscores. Actually, any space is an underscore, so that's an underscore too. Yeah, so there's going to be, once you're there, there's actually 3 different servers, but they're all going to have the same username and password. So all you really need to do here is go to where it says student and put your name in one column, and that whole row is going to be all your credentials. So what you would do for Phantom when we get there, same username credentials, you would just copy over the server name, and once you're at that link, you would use those credentials. And if you're unable to access that link, then you should use alternate. That's a LinkedIn Smart Link. If that doesn't work for you, then also let us know. So for now, if you can just make sure you jot down that you've grabbed a row, and then make sure you can access at least one of the instances. They're all running on similar servers, so if you can access one, then you're just caught up and good to go. And I'll walk you through some of our next steps as we move forward. Yep. So in that case, we will have to email you the credentials, or I can just give them to you. Let's see here.
I can get it.
Can you? Yeah. So Mark is going to be assisting for anyone that is unable to hit the first link. And essentially, the second link has all the documents that are on there, so you can still get everything yourself except for your server information. And while everyone is logging in, if you can just test to make sure, once you're at the link, try to log in. No one should have issues actually logging in if you can get to the link where it's asking for a Splunk login for any of them. If you do, then I have some suggestions, because those credentials should just be the same for everyone, and we have more than enough servers, so just yell out if you have any issues. How's everyone doing? Anyone need more time? More time? Okay. Take your time.
Good to go in the email? Awesome.
Sure. You can leave those blank. Those are for Mark if he needs to help you guys with something. So those are not for anyone to use. Thank you.
Yeah, you should have 3 tabs up. It's 3 separate servers.
Yep.
I'm not going to get it. I was going to say, I think I had a couple new ones, so I'm going to go down that quickly.
Any other issues? Yeah. Hey, Mark, when you get a chance, can you help that gentleman, please?
Yep.
Thank you. All right. With that being said, we'll start pressing forward. Some of this part of the workshop will be pretty straightforward and introductory. So if you're having issues, Mark's going to be able to make sure we can troubleshoot and get through all that. What we're going to do now is talk a little bit about some of the workstations that are involved in some of the activity within Frothy, right, that could have malicious intent. And the first part of this whole workshop, we're going to focus on the APT driving behavior. So we're going to use UBA. We're going to use a little bit of enterprise security to investigate what we can do and find. So again, this is just our SIM, right? So as we're in our environments, let's make sure we can log into the ES instance. It's going to show up as just Splunk Enterprise, I think, in the sheet as I stated there. And once you get in there, I think the next slide is highlighting how you can actually hop on over there. So you'll see all your apps on the left side, and you want to hop into Enterprise Security. And while everyone is doing that, if you're a little bit newer to Splunk, typically the default app for Splunk is called Search and Reporting. But all the apps in each environment are listed here, and really you're only using one Splunk Enterprise instance for this workshop, which is the Enterprise Security app. And once you're into Enterprise Security, I'd actually like everyone to also log into UBA. So in your sheet, you'll have that UBA column, same password, same username and password. You can just copy and paste those in. So what we want ideally is you have two tabs, ES and then UBA, because we'll be switching back and forth between two. And once you're pretty much logged into both and you have those tabs, let's head on over to Incident Review. When you're in Enterprise Security, you should see it as a tab at the top. Once you're in ES, head on over to Incident Review. And so this is the layout you're going to get. It's essentially, like I mentioned, Splunk Enterprise Security, it's still doing analytics. It's just security implications that are driven off our searches in Splunk Enterprise. So what you get in Incident Review are all your filters for how you can decide as an analyst, in your case you're Alice, right, what you want out of this information. So on here you see the three different things, right? You want to click on over here and make sure you're putting in the correct date. So that August 20th I mentioned earlier, we want to get that in here. So one thing to keep in mind here, you'll pick before. The punctuation actually matters here. So if you mess up and put in like a colon, it's actually not going to work and it'll throw you an exception error. This one? The time one? It should say like last 24 hours or something in your environment. It's called a time picker. Once you click on it, you'll get a little drop down where you can change it to this little time picker. Yeah, so you would do date and time range and then before. You could technically do this a few different ways though. You could do between and put the same thing, but that would be repetitive. And so that's, we're doing 3 p.m. here with 1500. And then once you're there, you can go ahead and hit apply. What was the question? August 20th. Yeah, I wouldn't be able to see it either. It's 2018. We're going to use that date a lot, so you'll probably have it memorized after a few more minutes, but it's going to be that same date the whole time, if I recall correctly. Yeah, 8/20, 2018, so yeah. And then we're actually going to apply some more filters here. And we're working off our notables. So we want to add a status of new. So you'll see the little drop downs. You really just want to add in that new status. And then we're also changing security domain because we know this is likely going to be a threat in the scenario and information we have. So you'll click on new. And then make sure you get threat right here. Let's do this. Laser pointer. And for this, you could in theory, be typing in something other than threat and get the same results. But Alice is just going off of, the information she has right now. And then once you're there, you can hit submit. That's when you're actually executing your search, your filtered search. So now you should get around five new notables. And they're in the threat domain. We really just updated the urgency, and this was supposed to be a basic, exercise to help you understand using some of the filters. But as you see, we got those results. What we really want to do is start using a lot of these expand signs. That's going to actually open up all the details that we want as an analyst. So right now we're in our different notables. We're always going to want to investigate each incident. So here we see suspicious behavior. That's a particular notable. It should be your third event down. So go ahead and expand that. So here we can see a lot of the information, right? We can see the description, and this is coming out of UBA that I was highlighting earlier. All that's being pulled in based on the threat activity that's detected in UBA. It's coming into Splunk Enterprise. We could go in further and look at different anomalies on this particular event, but just wanted to highlight, it's coming out of that UBA instance. But now what we can do is actually pivot over to UBA to actually see that. So as you can see here, once you click the little arrow, you can see the view contributing anomalies. So once you hop on over to UBA, has anybody here used UBA before? Okay. So hop on over to the UBA tab. We'll talk about some of the basics here. Really what most analysts use UBA for is, for the most part, getting these KPIs, right? So particular threats that are coming out, particular anomalies, and then drilling into what they are, right? So we're going to be working on those different stakeholder names we said earlier, Kevin, I think Bruce. What we're trying to do in this scenario is see what's going on with a particular profile of a particular person and where we could find particular threats. So we'll do 5 minutes of an exercise. So I know I didn't really show you much in UBA, but what we like to do in these workshops is let you play around, get to know the user interface before we go into specific steps on how to complete things. So just like you did in enterprise security, you can actually search in UBA. So what you can do is play around, use these three essentially artifact terms, right? So you have an executable or two executables, and you have essentially FIO or L, which is pretty much a profile, right, of a particular user. So try using these three. Go into UBA, see if you can find any type of activity that would be useful to Alice Bluebird, right, to figure out what's going on with Frothley. So we'll do 5 minutes, and then we'll circle together. I'm here if you guys need help or want to talk about anything outside of this about Splunk if you finish a little early. So I'll set a timer for 5. I saw a lot of folks putting in some good keywords. You really just had to try out these words. But we'll quickly go through one way of using these terms and kind of investigating from an analyst perspective. But here you can see on the left side of the screen, you can pick suspicious behavior, for example, because that's what Alice is looking for. And then, since that, you can filter by the threat, right? The threat type, since that was the name of the particular notable event in enterprise security. So this is one way of navigating, right? You can kind of go in and see that suspicious behavior. In this case, I recommend walking through and just following this way so you can see the different UI aspects of using UBA from this perspective. But it's going to list out, right? Like right now, if you're putting in some specific search, which will be on one of the next slides, what you can see in these particular threat categories, the different participants, right? So you wouldn't even really have to type in FI order for the most part, and it may bring it up with the correlation because the whole back end of UBA is using machine learning, right? So, and then again, we're going off that August 20th date for most of our stuff here, but if you keep scrolling down there and you look at the actual threat, we can see the description that was carried over to ES that we saw earlier. And it's really pushing all that data in. So if you keep scrolling down, let's see what this next. Yeah, so you see the particular anomalies that made up that particular threat, right? So you see the participants again, like I mentioned, the summary. So in this case, it's PowerShell behavior, which could be like PowerShell Empire or something else on that particular date, right? But go ahead and click this so we can kind of dig into what's happening in the activity around PowerShell. And we continue to, right now we're just trying to get into a profile, like I mentioned, right? We're looking at, in this case, we see, okay, PowerShell activity was a little suspicious. We have a little bit of an analysis around what that means, because I might not know that, right? When I'm Alice, I'm trying to see what's happening broadly in the environment. I do see it's an internal device, right? So that maybe makes me feel a little more safe that there's not an external threat. And then really just more vectors down here around the features. It's also doing some risk rating with the factors, and then you can see the actual, for example, here, entropy analysis around PowerShell detection, right, with specific character strings. So it's giving you a ton of information to utilize as you're going through your analysis. But go ahead for now, click on FI odor, and that'll give more detail around what's happening with that particular profile. And here we can see the threats, right? The threats associated, anomalies, like I mentioned earlier. But the key thing to highlight here is you can actually pivot pretty quickly for the same IOC, if you will. And you can go from what the threat is right down to the anomaly. I was showing that gentleman there earlier. If you're seeing a particular threat for FI order, go ahead and do this with me. Go ahead and click the little triangle under. That'll flop right away so you can kind of see a new view, which should have on the next slide. So that has the breakout of the different threats associated with the particular entity itself. In this case, is that particular system that's called FI order L. So hopefully everyone's following along. Let's go ahead and click this flag in that left toolbar. Again, this is pivoting from the threats that we just saw down to the anomalies. And now we can see that this contains a specific user named FI order, right? So we've been seeing the system the whole time called FI order L. In addition, we see these two files that we used in our search earlier, tar.exe, and we have the whoami.exe, right? We're seeing some additional files in there, so like FOD helper, and then hdor.exe. So for context, for whoami.exe, that allows someone to see what user they're logged in under. So that's kind of like searching. This would be more from an adversary perspective, though. tar.exe, I'm sure some of you are familiar. It's just for file archiving, right? So we kind of see what's happening there. HDoor, that's, when I think HDoor, I think of malware. I know this gentleman was asking earlier, but that's, some vendors, right? So you have like VirusTotal, different vendors that are looking from a security analysis perspective. You see HDoor is kind of like a little bit of a threat to Atlas, saying, okay, what is this executable doing in my environment? So now, hopefully everyone got a good idea of, UBA at a high level, pretty basic, UI that we went through there. Let's switch on back to enterprise security. So now this is a list, right, of all the indicators, right? Our IOCs, we had that tar.exe, whoami, FOD helper, HDoor around some maybe malware activity happening. Now we know our asset is that system, right, FYODER-L. And now we have an identity right down there at the bottom for FYODER. And what we could do, we could take these different indicators and perform more investigations, if you will, in Splunk to see what's going on, right? Because we know that there's an APT involved. These files likely have something to do with all that activity. And I'll talk more about assets and identities, how you can use search. The whole part of this next part of the workshop is using some of the features in enterprise security to pinpoint how you can get information about a particular either identity, a particular asset, or really anything that you find in your logs, right? So we're going to do another exercise. We'll probably do 5 minutes for this as well. Me and Mark will walk around again. But here, we found certain information to date, and we want to do some of these searches in ES now, right? So we were in UBA for a quick few 5 minutes. As you start using enterprise security, you'll see it's just like Splunk, where it's just a bunch of queries, but it's running security analytics, right? So go on in. There's a big hint here of like what you can do in enterprise security instead of just searching in a bar. So try using all these artifacts, right? Go in, see what you can find. What you're really doing here is you're being Alice, right, as a reminder. So you're trying to figure out, like as a hint, right, you're trying to figure out what's happening to Frothley's environment. And really you have everything there. If you go in, give it a shot. If you find something cool and you want to share with the team, the whole group here, we'll have you share as well. But we'll give it a 5 minute because I don't think this one really takes 10 minutes. And then we'll circle back. Looks like everyone's starting to have fun with the searches, so that's good. I'm going to go through one example of how to investigate these artifacts, if you will. But what everyone's doing is the right way to do it, right? There actually isn't one particular way. Some folks are writing searches outside of the investigator. That's how it was done before enterprise security was made, right? So there's not an exact answer for this, and you can't break stuff when you're searching, right? So everything is good as far as these investigations we got going. So here, this is summarizing what a lot of you have already done, but this is called the SA investigator specific asset. With this, you can pick what you're going after, right? So, of course, all those files are probably going to be under artifacts or under investigate files or process artifacts, right? You can get a little bit of information out of both. So if you've already done this, you don't have to redo it, but I recommend following along if you didn't actually get to use this capability in the UI. So go on over to SA Investigator and then click on this middle one, which is focusing on investigating the particular files and then the process artifacts. One thing I actually forgot to mention, on that G drive, there's a search guide. So that could actually save a lot of heartbreak, or a headache, should I say, as you're starting to do some of this. So if you do fall a little behind, go into that in that G drive, there's a file. It's called, I named it search guide or something. That has all these. I think this one is, so the slide we're on is S12, investigate file / process artifacts. So as we're going through all this, you actually have a guide that you can follow. If you want to go through this later, I actually have these instances running until tomorrow, actually. So if you want to play with this environment tonight, you're welcome to go back and mess around with it. But here, let's start with we had those different artifacts. Let's try the whoami.exe and investigate where we've seen this being used. So go ahead and enter in that whoami.exe. And you'll put that in the file / process name that you see there. And the big thing is you don't really need to change anything else here. The main thing is the date, again, that August 20th. And then once you got that in there, go ahead and submit, which will execute that search. And then once you're there, we actually want to click on endpoint. That's our scenario, right? We want to see what's happening. I mean, you can see the details first, but then eventually move on over to endpoint, and then you'll see what we're picking out here. You'll get a brand new tab, right? So this is essentially showing the execution of the different processes, right? So we see whoami ran 6 times on that August 20th time frame, just on that FY order L system. And of those different times, let's see, we ran under the context of FY order and under the NT authority system account. That seems excessively high, right? I mean, high privilege for the whoami to be running. So that could maybe indicate something like maybe privilege escalation. So we're going through our logs. We see some funny activity going on here. As an analyst, we see something's up, right? So, sure. So I think if you scroll over, there should be a host name. I don't have a lot. So you can scroll over. There should be and if it's not doing that, there's a way to get it as well. Like if you scroll over this way, do you see it? Or no? Okay.
It's gathering this data via endpoints having a service reporting to this, right? So you got to
What's your question? Yeah, this particular data is probably coming in through a forwarder, right? So it is on the actual agent. Yeah. But you could also get that off the wire, technically, if you're using something like Splunk Stream or a different application, and there's a file exchange, like it could pick up on it like that too, in a different form of ingest, if you will, or from a different tool. So. Any other questions before we move forward? Okay. So we have this brief summary here of what we have, and just keep it in the back of your head since we're doing a little bit of an analysis here. We're talking about the whoami, right? Executed 6 times. We have this timeline, which you don't really need to memorize, but we have, I mentioned the cloud environment earlier, right? So executed in the context of user. AD, right? So we got some Active Directory information 5 times. NT authority system, we have a little bit of a timeline on that. We want to figure out why that was such a high permission. So again, I recommend using that search guide as we're going through this, just because it's a lot of clicking for you. But let's get back to details and enter that tar.exe. So this is just a different way to look at it, right? Put that into the text box. And leave that index at main. It should fill that in by default. Yes, there could be scenarios where you do need to change that, but for this, we can keep it the same. Let's put in that August 20th timeline again. And then head on over to endpoint again. And what we can do here, we can click on tar.exe in that endpoint state little process detail section. So that'll click into the actual process, right? So click on process name. And you can play around with this. You can click some of the other stuff too in new tabs. But once you get to that executable, you can see here that we can actually drill down into the file. And that's in endpoint, and we can get to raw logs. So this is where some heavy security analyst hats can be put on. And we can review that event. We can see that the exe created a new file on that line called archive.tar. And we can also see the parent image and some of that extra stuff, like the tar.exe ran from, I think, a registry key on here. So we can see what type of activity is happening in the environment. Me personally, I'd probably try to find a GitHub link to some of this PowerShell activity that's happening in there to look for a backdoor type of situation. But these events are basically just a result of tuning on process execution, right? So this is coming from sysmon. You could also do this in Windows event logs, right? So if you get those events coming in from Windows events, you could look at some similar activity. But the whole idea here is looking, the connection between parent processes and some of the child processes and where there could be some malicious intent. And we've talked about this so far, but let's add our findings on that executable to what we already have on that who am I executable to kind of put together some pieces on what's happening within Frothley's environment. So what we could do here, we could take that archive.tar, just our other artifact. We can see what that's up to. So you could here go back to the investigator and go to file/process artifacts. That'll be your particular tab, right, if you see that at the top. And I was mentioning to a different gentleman earlier, you can actually do this in some of the other tabs, depending on how you're writing out the searches with the artifacts, but this is just one way. So let's put in that archive.tar. Let's go back to the artifacts tab, and then let's click on details. And once we have that tar, that archive.tar in there, let's hit submit. We should get some new results. And once you get those results back, let's click on endpoint again. So here, this is just showing us that, the archive.tar was accessed, right? The red arrow on the bottom of the screen, that's really just showing that you can kind of scroll over. That's what I was kind of mentioning earlier. In some of these environments, you may need to go to the right to see some of the stuff going on. But we can see that, the user who accessed the file was FYOda, right, who we've been talking about. And that was via OneDrive. But what else could we do? We could look at the raw logs, right, like I mentioned earlier. So anytime we want to do that, we can just head right on over to search. And so this is, again, the raw search of the detail we saw earlier, right? But it provides a little bit more context. You can dig a little bit deeper. But look at this middle bubble, right? So you can see the operations called out, the file downloaded, right? So the file was not just accessed. It was first of all accessed, and then it was eventually downloaded, which is any downloads are a risk from a security perspective, right? What else do we see in here? We see a client IP of the file that was 199.66.91.253. And we've pivoted into a whole new data source here, right? And, there's different TAs for Splunk. So in this case, for Microsoft 365, this data is being pulled from 365's management activity API. So that's coming into Splunk. If you want to have a chat about that later, if anyone's like a SharePoint guru, we can definitely talk about how you can use some of that data from a security perspective. And here we're just highlighting some of the stuff we touched on. We have a lot of the details around these different artifacts. As I mentioned, you can use all those details. You can do it just in the search bar, but using some of the features in enterprise security make it a little bit easier because you have some of those views around, looking at the endpoint specifically, getting some of those details that are already pre-populated. So we've gone through a few artifacts here. We did the archive.tar, which we discovered. We identified a new identity that we could look at. So we could look at the external IP address, and I mentioned PowerShell earlier, which was used with that tar.exe, right? Because PowerShell was in that activity that we were seeing within Splunk. So we can do a lot of things here. So Alice is a security analyst, right? We have all this information. Really, all we needed was all that on the left to search into Splunk. But we can do much more with that as we're hopping into enterprise security. Really just have to put on a security hat and see what our next steps are, right? So let's do an exercise here. We'll do another 5 minutes. We have some newer indicators, though, that you see on the screen, right? I mentioned the IP address as I was talking earlier. Let's do some searches in enterprise security. Now we've gone through some forms of searching in ES. You can use what we already did, but try to expand on that, right? There's some features we haven't touched, but take in these different, these newer artifacts and try to find something curious, if you will. And then we'll circle back. I'll walk around if anyone has any questions or just wants to talk about this. It was supposed to be great. But, yeah. All right, so we will press forward. We got some folks doing some really good searches. By the way, we got Sonny here now. He's another one of my engineers. So if he's walking around, he's another Splunk expert. So we're welcoming him in. Let's push forward, though. So I was working with a lot of you, and we're just going through and trying to execute some new searches. There's particular ways that we can start using this new information, particularly the IP address, to get back some results that are useful from a security perspective. And a little bit later, I'll talk about, if you don't know something, one of our gentlemen here mentioned, if I don't know what HDOR is, how do I find that out, right? When I start talking about SOAR, I'll talk about some of the useful resources that we can use from a security perspective, either outside of Splunk or Splunk. We have a few apps that can point us to the right direction when we're trying to investigate. But here, let's work through the other two files, that we're mentioning here. We found these threats in UBA, right? They targeted FYORL, FOD helper, which we'll talk a little bit more about, and then HDOR. So let's go ahead and make sure that we are in this part of the investigator. So I know it gets a little repetitive here when you're seeing investigate, but you want to be in here because we're starting to look at processes, right? So we're not just looking at particulars on the executable. We want to see what happened as processes start or shut down, etc. And again, as you're referencing the documents, the search guide, we should be at S15 for the exercises, right? So if you go back and play with this a little bit later, you can kind of just get to the conclusion here and kind of like mess with the data rather than trying to figure out what I said or what we were doing in the workshop today. But if we enter the file name fodhelper.exe and click submit, that's a big one, right? We got to hit submit. You could just hit enter too, but hit submit, and then from there click on endpoint. And then that should be one of your last clicks. But as we review the different processes, I don't see anything sticking out here. We see all the typical stuff that we would see in a log. But what we want to click on is the process fault helper.exe in the first event here. And once you click into that, you should get this data coming up. So we see all 4 process creation events, and these are actually coming from Sysmon. And we see additional information here, right? We see information about the process execution and like I mentioned earlier, the parent command line. You can see all the flags, right, in some of these logs. But we could examine, in this example, the parent command line, as all events have the same value. But just keep a note of what you're seeing here, right? You don't really have to really dig into anything further here, but let's see what else we can find. So what we want to do is go back to if you open a new tab, or if you just hovered over, go on back to investigate in that artifacts tab. And now we'd be seeing, we want to put in the other malicious file that we mentioned, right? So HDOR is something malicious. You may not know that as a security analyst, but we want to investigate that further. So put in hdor.exe. You can keep everything else the same. Once you hit click, one thing that I'll point out is the date, right? So if that's changing to all time, by default you're going to get 0 results and you're going to be stuck. Because none of the logs for this bot's data are from 2023 at all. So go ahead and hit submit there, and then we want to head on over to endpoint again. So what can we see here? We see that HDOR was read from the temp directory, which it's an odd place to put an executable, right? So go under endpoint. The state process details, we can see that HDOR executable. That was actually run after the file change event, right? So go ahead and, just like earlier we clicked on the executable, let's click on HDOR in that process name. So I know a lot of folks were having some search issues. Hopefully it's just a time picker. Can't really autofill that, but I would just copy the date into like a notepad and then paste it in. So here we see, what is this, a single sysmon log, right, for that executable. If we click on command line on the left here, we can see that hdor.exe looks to be running against a kind of a range here of servers on that internal kind of on-prem network. This is within Frothly, right? So you may need to scroll down to be able to see some of this actually, but you want to be able to see this in the event. So you're using the field though, right? So on the left side? Yeah. From the search, so here at the top. I can't even see that. So this is the data model is essentially pointing at specific indexes, right, that we were talking about. But the actual search that we're talking about, this is just what you put in to the field, right, for the artifact itself, and then it's using FIOTA for the destination. So it's essentially looking for everything in Splunk, right, pointing at these data models. So yeah, it's getting this raw event, but you're tailoring the search, if that makes sense. Does that answer your question? Because it's the raw event. I know. This one? So it's pulling out, so like a pair, right? You have fields and values in these logs, there's command line. This should be JSON, yeah. Yeah, it looks like JSON. This is, it depends where it's getting it from. I think it probably is. Let's see. Oh, it's using sysmon. So, yeah. Does that make sense? Okay. So thinking back to just a comment on this, we were talking about UBA earlier. We had the threat tied to FI order L. And the files that were associated with those anomalies, we got a lot of that information, right? So we started in UBA. We had all that information. A lot's on here, but we did a lot of these actions going into Splunk, right? We talked about Azure, the different cloud environments. We haven't gotten into AWS yet, but I think we're getting there kind of. We're going to do that a little bit more in SOAR, but just keep that in mind. We started at UBA. We saw a threat. We saw some malicious odd activity. And then we went in, we searched, and we got some additional information. So this is kind of where we're at now, summarizing again. We got this, essentially identify this internal IP address that we have on here. Appears to be scanned, but we also gathered more information around these files as we went through these different exercises. So, we see what's associated with our threats here, and we know what to do next. So this is more focused on doing some of these searches around. Now we have the new executable for PowerShell. I'll walk through this one together just to make sure we get through everything. But pause, and if you have thoughts or questions, let me know. So now we're thinking users, right? So earlier we had a bunch of executables. What we want to focus now is what we want to focus on now is an identity. So thinking of a person, right, instead of a system that's taken any type of actions in our security environment. So from ES, let's head on over to investigate identity artifacts. So we're still under the SA investigator. You'll see a similar UI once you get there. So now what we want to do is narrow our time picker to a specific date and time. So we've been doing mainly just a date, aside from one exercise. Let's go ahead and set the date range back to August 20th. And let's go ahead and hit submit after that. We're not really changing much here. We're just adding in an identity this time. You will see that the correlated identities will populate based on the user. So if you put Bill in there and that exists in there, we'll have our identities correlating based on our data model. So let's go ahead and hit submit. So what we should see back now is, this list of notable events. Now this is referencing just identities, right? So if you put in something like those executables, you probably won't get as useful results, right? So that's a big change here, right? We can see some PowerShell code encoded, right? The specific processes. We see Mimikatz. I think a local admin creation notable. Yep. And there's things that we would want to dig into for due diligence, right, from a security perspective if we're seeing all these processes, right? So we could click on a particular notable. So on the far right here, we could pivot into the incident review. But we don't need to do that right now. Just keep in mind as you're typing in these searches, you have to explore a little bit, right? From an analyst perspective, it's not all there. Once we start automating stuff, that's when some of this gets cut out. So I'll talk about that a little bit later for what I mean. So let's take a look at the authentication tab just so we kind of see what kind of data we get back there. We see the identity was seen logging into these systems, and it's actually from multiple IP addresses. So same identity, different IP address, right? That's kind of unusual. So using the IP location commands, we can see that the main login attempts we see Canada, Hong Kong, the Bay Area, which would make a little bit more sense because of the company. But then the right panel, we can see which logins occurred from specific IP addresses, right? And from specific apps. So, and you can, as you scroll down, you can hit number 2 in that lower right panel. It'll give you more results. I think the next slide. Yep. And here, just a larger view. You can see Canada and Hong Kong IPs with more so successful authentication. Events are using FIOTer's login. And now we're touching Microsoft, right? So MS Cloud for the infrastructure itself. That's what Fraudly is using. If you head on over to change here. Now here we can see an account is also being used here, right, to create a local account. I think we see SVNC. So that's odd behavior to engage in, right? Just creations, deletions. That's something that an admin should be doing, not just a user. And we're looking at FIOTer-L here, so it makes for suspicious, conclusions here. So you can keep scrolling down and kind of see what's going on there, but we're noting stuff that is of security risk. So here we can click endpoint. We can see the file system events on the endpoint. What do we see here? OneDrive, SharePoint. We see that type of activity in FIOTer's document folder. So you see archive.tar. That's being read by the identity, right, that we searched. So if you scroll to the right here, right, you'll see the vendor product. That field itself contains OneDrive and SharePoint. So it kind of points out at least what the applications are that may be targeted. And then you see some additional things in the endpoint dashboard. We can see the processes that have been run over time, things like that. But what we want to do here, let's move on to the network section so we can see a little bit more around what's happening. We want to see what's associated with this identity that we've been searching. And we see a series of kind of like VPN events here, going to a Cisco that looks like an adaptive security appliance, right? And all of these came from that IP address that we saw earlier, which was geolocated in San Fran, right? And so, since FIOTer is in San Fran, we can say that that's likely where he's located when that attack was going on. So it just points out, like, we're seeing different locations, but we have an idea of where it's actually happening from rather than where they want us to think it's happening from, whoever the adversary is. Essentially a lot of things that I just mentioned, but just keep in mind all the activities we're going through, right? If you want to go back in, I kept these instances open till tomorrow. You can play around and kind of mess with the data. Yep. Yeah, so even outside of enterprise security, there's not just correlation searches, but there's detections that are looking for not brute force, right? Because you have a good question, but they're just looking for certain attempts and where the location is. It goes off some of the commands we talked about earlier, not necessarily just IP location, but just geolocate and things like that. So you can also shut down services based on that. So I'll go through a section in SOAR where I think we don't do it based on location, but we do stuff with some of like the ACLs and stuff like that with a similar scenario. So that was our little bit of an analysis of identities, right? outside of just typical artifacts. We added in an IP address to our list of those IOCs. So 104.207.83.63 IP. And now we have this new executable with Internet Explorer, right? So as an analyst, we need to keep reviewing what our different indicators are of what could be a compromise, what could be a future potential for a breach. So now I'll give us all an exercise because this one could be some fun. We got 248 here. Let's do 5 minutes on this. Again, we're still using the investigator. This would just be like a little break as well since you've been in this part of ES. So go ahead and try some of these new indicators, see if you find anything. Within 5 minutes, we'll go through this real quick and we'll move on to some more fun stuff. And we'll circle back in 5. So, this one might be one you want to look at later. The two things here really are just entering in the IP and then making sure the date is August 20th again. But for this, you got to keep in mind not every single tab will have some data generated. So depending on what you're looking for, you should get details back. We had some good questions around doing IP ranges, using wildcards. All that can be typed into there. You just have to keep in mind that these input boxes are generating a search. So you can kind of customize that in your own application if you're using ES or any other form of an application that's using SPL. And again, here we can see with the results back, we see events for this IP that's actually in the Azure AD. Those are probably sign-in logs, yep. And we also see the Office 365 logs. So what we could do is click on that source type where we get that, MS : Active Directory sign-in situation going on. And this just depends on data sources, right? You may be unfamiliar with some of them, but like we mentioned earlier, you can search up a data source to see where you're seeing particular activity from. So we could drill down into the Azure AD sign-in logs. We can see users signed in from different IP addresses. On the left side of the screen are the selected and interesting fields, right, that I was mentioning earlier when we were talking about command line. And these are all extracted at search time. I didn't really talk about that, but that's just how Splunk works, right? It does this on the fly, per se, where you type in a search. None of those fields are there until the search is executed by the interpreter, right? So you change that search just a little bit, you might get a little new set of brand new fields, which is different than a traditional database model, so just kind of want to point that out. So here, just find the field user, click on that. You may need to scroll down a little bit here, but get to user in that alphabetical list. Once you get there, we can see FIOder and a user named KLogger field, right? So that's Kevin from Frothley. We've seen they've signed in from this particular IP address. So go ahead and click on Kevin's email there so we can drill into the search and just investigate a little further. Now, if we scroll to the bottom of this list of events, we'll see different event logs, right? They're showing the particular identity, which is Kevin. He's attempting to log in from our, suspicious IP. He's trying to get into Office 365, into that portal, and had a little bit of a failure. So when you scroll up, you'll start seeing that 11.43.32.927 you see there. The events, indicate success, right? So we're seeing something worked, right? Now that we see that, we need to see what else Kevin was up to on this particular system to make sure he's not doing stuff that's against security policy, right? So open up that identity investigation tab. If you don't have it, you might already have it open, right? So you can just go to that and head on over to the identity investigator. And then what we're going to do, we're just going to put in the email for Kevin, right? So similar to what we've been doing in our other searches, we'll just add in August 20th again. And if you're not on details in the tabs, let's head over there. And we can see a notable event that's been created today. Indicates that the identity is expired, right, in the identity table. And it's being used. So what we can do is click search, right, as I mentioned earlier. That'll give us access to some of the more raw logs. So this, we're just looking at source types, right, returns of events. We see a number of Linux events popping up, right? But we also see Azure again, AAD. We looked at that already, but we also see some audit events now. So we can see, what's in there. So go ahead and click on this audit here. That'll be Microsoft. Microsoft's Azure Active Directory. And so this is one of the Splunk terms is drill down, right? We're always trying to drill down into our data, especially as security folks. So our drill down search returns these particular values from Active Directory, right, from Azure. That's our particular source type. For that identity, though, right, of Kevin. So if you scroll down to the left, you'll see in the fields, we see these different fields, right, as I mentioned earlier. Let's go ahead and click activity. And again, like to your question earlier, this is just coming out of these raw logs. We're picking out a field. In this case, it's showing us top 10 values for that field in the list, right? We see actions. These include things like resetting a password, adding new roles for users. We care probably about changing passwords and stuff around authentication. And just, management activities from an admin perspective. So go ahead and click on Add Member. And you'll get back this single event. Now this is JSON, right? We just see this result of JSON. We need to expand some of these fields. So let's look inside actor and targets here. That's a little small, but that makes sense, right? Because we're looking for, we were looking at actions, right? So let's look inside those. Notice that the activity results, the status is success, right? So that's where I come in as an analyst. I see the member was actually added to a role. So just make sure you click actor here. That should expand the JSON. We can get a little deeper. So when we expand this portion of actor, right, we can see that the user initiated that initiated this particular change was FIOTA, right, who we've been trying to look into. So we get that confirmation. Let's click on targets next. And this is a lot of nested JSON, right? So I remember I went through this. There's some additional, pluses that need to be opened down here. You can click on all of them if you want, but I just need to highlight. I'll highlight some of them. So the ones that have arrows next to them. Basically here, what Microsoft is telling us is that Kevin, right, has been assigned a new role, which is the admin. He previously had no role, and the object name was tenant admins. So it's just giving us information about Kevin, right? Like what he was and like what he is now. So we see what kind of escalation is happening. Anyone have issues with this JSON? I feel like it's it's just fun to nest into if you really want to. Just highlighting some of the stuff I just mentioned, right, around the workstations. Any questions so far about Kevin or anything? Cool. Which ones? Which dashboards are you referring to? Oh, the asset investigator? Yeah. It's commonly used, especially if you're looking for... The app itself? Are you saying for enterprise security or just the dashboard? Because... So... Yeah. Right. So enterprise security. So this is part of enterprise security. So it's probably not as accessible. But what I would say is you can find the same SPL, which is the code to write that like dashboards like this. So if you go on Splunkbase, have you used Splunkbase before? Splunkbase is just it's our app store. It has free and paid apps. But if you went on Splunkbase, you could find that same similar type of dashboard that has a search that's generated to do the same thing, and you can just copy that into one of your apps. The hard part is the correlation that it's doing, right? So if you're running it in a SIM environment, you might not be able to do it the same way. But if you're just looking for the SPL, that's pretty much publicly accessible. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, you can get the template. You can get a template. So I would look at security essentials. So because you can't get access to ES without a license, but you can go to it's called SSE on Splunkbase. It has a template for basically doing the same thing. Because like you mentioned, it's a pretty basic search, right? It's just a query running against the IP. But the actual dashboards, if you just went into a Splunk Enterprise environment and you wanted to copy in what it looks like, you could just get that off of like Security Essentials on Splunkbase. Are you talking about the CSS or the XML? Yeah, you can get the XML. There's an XML editor. Yeah, so there's an editor. When you said HTML, that's where you can get access to HTML, but yeah, the XML. There's an yeah. So yeah, no, I got you. So each dashboard you can access the editor for the XML. So you can just copy the XML from there. If you need what are you trying to drop it into? For example. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you're talking about the XML for the panels and stuff. Yeah. Yeah. So you can copy. You'll probably even find GitHub repos of like the code for this because there's a site called I think Go Splunk. It has a bunch of search stuff, but it also has like if you're trying to do like dashboards, it's called Go Splunk if I'm not mistaken. It's like Splunkers, so folks that work at Splunk and just Splunk enthusiasts outside of it. They have a bunch of. Yeah, you should copy. Yeah, it's a waste of time to redo anything. So, I appreciate it. Yeah, you bet. Cool. All right. So whoops, these slides are spazzing on me. So this exercise I'll go through with everyone just so we can kind of wrap up the essay investigator. We have some more indicators here. I don't want this to feel too repetitive to anyone, but at the end of the day, what we're doing with these specific asset investigators is using whatever the analyst finds, right, from a threat intel perspective and putting it into Splunk. So I'll quickly summarize what this next one is. I won't make you do it on your own, but we're still using IP addresses, right, where we have some more in our heads. You don't really see it on the screen, but like context, we just went into the JSON. We know like what's happening with Kevin and such. So this is where we start thinking of what our other indicators our indicators are, right, within our IOCs. So we could continue working with these specific assets, right? Let's look at one more file that we uncovered, which was the process running frequently, right? So like we saw it multiple times under FYOder's account. That was the Internet Explorer, exe. So let's head on over to file process artifacts, and we'll execute some searches in there to get a little bit more intel. So let's enter in Internet Explorer.exe, same time, and hit submit. And we get some interesting results here. There are a few additional source types, but really in this case, you got to think about sysmon, things like Windows event logs. Those are significant here. We also see this file not just on FYODL, but also on one of the server IPs here, 192.168.9.30. So just some pieces that we can pick out here as we're going through, this basic search. Let's click on endpoint again. Now, as we look at some of these process details in our search results, one thing we see is all the times that Internet Explorer's executable was run starting, let's see, 11:05. If you keep scrolling down, you'll see more, I'm sure. But we can see sysmon saw the file written to the C drive, right? So that was in the directory around 1047. The fact that an executable is in the temp directory is the main kind of cause of concern here, though, right? I mean, it should make any security analyst kind of curious. So, in that case, you would probably want to investigate further. So you scroll back up and click on the Windows process starts right here. And we're looking at particular event code 4688. And we could also look at the process command line field, right, that we talked about earlier, and get not only the specific executable, but the detail including things like different flags being sent in, the different switches, any argument coming in, right, from the command line. But as we look at the detail, we can see that the executable is making calls to that 192 IP. What is that? That's over port 8080. And it looks like there's some Linux commands being issued, including that who am I that we talked about, ID groups. We see our good old cat command. We see Etsy's password, the Etsy password directory. And then, there appears to be multiple pages of these commands that we're seeing on the screen. You can click on to see what the other commands are. If you'd like, you can kind of scroll through. But what we've been doing is focusing most of our efforts, if you will, on the files. But looking at identities and a particular asset is important as well, depending on what we're looking for. There's just a lot you can use, right? With a lot of this information, you can go in and write all the SPL you want, but you can just go into the specific asset investigator and get all you need because it has those pre-populated tabs. All right. Now we can do some more fun stuff. Any questions before we move on to AWS? Does everyone know what S3 is? Does anyone not? I'll explain it if not. So, we're gonna work with S3 and ES. We're also gonna hop into SOAR and do some automation where we do some stuff with access control lists. But let's hop back into ES. We'll go back to our good old incident review once you get here. And now we'd be on our search guide. We're moving to S2 now because we're moving on to a different section in case you're referencing that. So the time picker, we've been using that the whole time. We're going to keep using the same time, the timeline, probably 3 p.m., August 20th. So go ahead and click on the time picker. Let's select that same date, that range for the date. Make sure you're using before. I remember some folks have had issues in the past with the time. And let's put in 1500 like we did at the beginning of the workshop. And then once you got all that in there, let's go ahead and hit apply. And once that's applied, let's hit submit. And again, we have all our notables here, right? So what we want to do here, now I mentioned S3, right? So we want to go to the particular S3 notable here, right? So you'll see public S3 bucket. Let's go ahead and expand that. And so here we can see a name of the notable, right? We're also seeing some tokens being passed in for the bucket, right, into the notable event. We can see the underlying correlation search by clicking on the correlation search, right? So I was talking about that earlier with someone. This is where you can see the actual search that's doing the actual correlation. So click on ESCU, detect new open S3 buckets for that particular rule, and that'll actually pop you into that correlation search. You probably won't be able to change it because you're not an admin, but just again, idea of if you're in ES and you want to see what a particular notable is doing to get the results back, you can just click into the correlation. And this is just on the slide, the search itself. And the notable we created from UBA, that's being pushed in here, right? So in this case, the correlation search is just classic SPL. Happens to be a part of one of the analytics stories in ES around cloud. So I know this gentleman asked about, where do I go find something if I see it in Splunk and I Google it. There's analytics stories in ES which are focused around like cloud, malware, particulars down to subcategories like malware, where you can find out a little bit more about that. And so in this case, with cloud, enterprise security content update is where you would access some of that information. So if you go back to the other tab in incident review, this is just highlighting the whole correlation search. You don't really need to know all of it, but this is what's actually executing everything that needs to be done for that notable to pick up on a detection. Now, here we could also add a notable to an investigation. So for you to do that, you could click that little, caret chevron on the right side of the screen and then click Add Event to Investigation. You could have 2 or 3 investigations going at once. So this is where analysts can kind of organize some of those aspects of their investigations and day-to-day. And we're not collaborators in this workshop environment, so you don't really need to do most of this, but you can kind of play around with what it's saying. If you want to add in your own user there, you can do that, and it'll update some of the investigations. So it probably won't let you add this particular notable to investigation. But I'll show you. You can click cancel here. That's just a permissions thing. But I can show you where you can see those investigations after you hit cancel. So if you want to, here's just an example. If you wanted to see all your investigations, if you're an analyst and maybe you're helping Frothly with like 2 or 3 investigations, this is where you would go under investigations. It would list out every single investigation you have going on. You could filter based on particular keywords. You could also create a new investigation. So go ahead and click on all investigations and then select this one for S3. It'll be website code and public S3 bucket. And that should get you into that investigation that's already ongoing. Now, when this investigation opens, you'll first see these 3 buttons: the workbench, timeline, the summary. Right? Those kind of explain themselves, but that's how an analyst would come in and navigate what they're seeing. But most commonly, you're going to go more to the right as you're trying to see your different events. The timeline would give you a view at the bottom of what you're actually, seeing as far as, you see malware activity, you see particular notables around S3 like we mentioned, maybe you see Azure stuff at a particular time, so it gives the analyst a good idea of what's happening based on time. So feel free to kind of mess around with that. You can kind of click through the different events. But it's just all notable events, right? And you can kind of take notes as an analyst in here. You're able to add in comments. You can also kind of collaborate. I'll talk a little bit more about that in SOAR, but specific searches, right, are what are happening here. So you can kind of just review this at your own pace as you're going through if you see different notables and stuff and you want to add them to investigations. So back to S3. What we want to do here is let's go to search. So click search in the ES navigation bar. This is, again, going to give us the raw logs in the result of our query. So once you hit search, you're sitting there with like a prompt to put in SPL, right, which is your Splunk processing language. So let's start with that broad search of the index and the specific source type, right? So for this case, this is the first time you're actually writing out SPL because you're writing into a search box, but you've been doing it in different text boxes as inputs. And this is going to give us an event to kind of work with here, right? The logs from a particular event. And since we're on AWS, right, I mean, as far as what we're searching here, most Splunk environments aren't just going to have S3 information. They're going to have other stuff from AWS, right? So like CloudTrail logs, like all the good stuff from the different services you might use in AWS or Azure, but this is just an example. So go ahead and add in that search, and then go ahead and hit search or just enter. I think that search is pretty straightforward. It's really just asking for the index. You're putting in the source type, which is S3 in this case. And once you hit enter, as we've been doing the whole time, you can expand that search to kind of investigate into the logs. And here we just want to look at these are the fields, right? We were seeing these on the left side before. Now we're just getting these in the raw data. So you see things like bucket name that can be seen right in the log stream. So kind of keep that. That's an important field when you're working with something like S3. You may need to use that if you're doing automation or just if you're trying to find a particular value, right? Buckets are where things are. You want to worry about if that's public, private, in between, right? So this is the notable we looked at first, right? So notice the time in these little boxes. Those values are going to help us refine our search as we're kind of moving forward here. I'll leave that up there so y'all can see that. And now we'll do another exercise. We only have a few left. This one will be 5 minutes. We have some more indicators, but now we're working with S3, right, since we kind of pushed on to this part of our investigation. So what we want to do is try to find something interesting. We'll take 5 minutes. You have essentially the date, right, a time, and then Frothly web code. But now you're trying to use the search function, right? So when you're in Splunk, try to write a query where you're actually finding something useful from this data. This part is pretty easy. You've been doing it the whole workshop. Just see what just type that in, see what you get, and then we'll talk a little bit more about what we can do with S3. So we'll do 5 minutes. For this one, feel free to, if you need to, use a restroom or something. We only have SOAR left after this, which will be surprisingly quicker. I think, some of you are excited about that. You can ask me some questions after we get through all of this content today. SOAR is one of my more background areas, so if you have any questions or anything, let me know. But we'll go through this, and we only have like a little bit left as far as content with SOAR, and then we'll wrap up. All right. Did anyone find anything interesting? Something? Okay. Yeah, because you just typed in the bucket name, right, at the time. That's where your search was, right? Okay. All right, we'll walk through this, and then we'll do some SOAR, which may be more fun for some folks. But they only gave us, so if we go back, right, like this is what Alice has, right? You have the name of the bucket, and you have the time. From there, Alice has to figure out what to do next, and that's kind of her part of being the security analyst. So what we could do here, right, we add in bucket name equals. So this is the SPL part, right? I didn't really go through SPL syntax with you all, but SPL is a little bit like Google. You can just type in stuff without any, field/values. You don't really need to be creating particular variables. If you end up doing a different workshop at some point, we can get deeper into SPL, explaining how you can kind of write out the syntax where it's a little bit more efficient to run a search. But when you're using something like enterprise security, it's pre-written for you. But what Alice needs to do here, she's found specific information and needs to use the information she has and go in and find things, right? So what comes to her mind is, hey, let's use bucket name, which is essentially a name of a field. Adding that to the existing search with the name of the bucket, which was Frothly Web Code, is tailoring the search to exactly what she wants. Because we know that the bucket was made public it was 1301. We had the same date of 8/20. We want to look for events after the bucket was made public in this case, right? Because we want to see everything that happened after, not before. So let's go ahead and add those details in. Really what you need to do is change the time here, have that SPL, and then we're changing this here. And then go ahead and hit apply. So once you either hit enter or click that magnifying glass, like it's saying, you should get around 110 events or rows. And this is for Alice to review, right? That's a lot, 110. that could take some time. But we should think about the question, right? So we want to know what happened around the public activity, right? Because we're thinking of, okay, what's going on in that S3 environment? As far as getting to the point here, we're going to use a few different commands here because this whole exercise was designed around using SPL. And it's okay if you didn't finish this. It's just something you can kind of start looking into if you're starting to use Splunk a little bit more. It definitely helps to know what the syntax is doing. So the table command, for example, that's one that's used here. Essentially what that does is any data you're getting back, right, is putting it in a tabular view. In the coming slides that I'm about to bring up here, we'll see a few different fields. Just put in the search if you can. You do have the search guide, so that would be S2-4, so you can actually just copy this search. You don't have to copy it off the screen whenever you're doing it. So just to see that you get some similar results, you can kind of fiddle around with the data. So build your search with all these fields that we're adding in here. And then, as Alice, you can go in and see what you get from these results. But it's basically just a lot of fields, right? The table command, the whole syntax is give me a table with specified fields. And then sort is just doing ascending or descending. You can specify the order, right? Everything above that is things we already did. Index, we've been using the main index the whole time. Our source is S3, and then we're just pointing to the particular bucket. Once you got that search on there, go ahead and execute it. So in this case, we sorted, right? If you saw on that last slide, these are going in chronological order, but you can just flip that. There's also a command. I think, yes, a reverse command. You can just use that to flip if you're ever in a scenario where you are querying. In our first 3 events, these that you see on the screen, looks like the AWS policy is passed as an argument to the put ACL command, right? So based on the fields that we selected in our search, we can see the IP address that this came from, and that bstol was the user who applied that ACL to that particular bucket that we were searching. And then, so after this bucket was made public, we see this external host, 52.66 onwards. That one is, that's accessing the bucket, so the error code of permanent redirect, that's doing what it says, right? It indicates that the request was addressed a resource, right, inappropriately. So this is just giving us all the detail around, what's happening with the API activity, with the specific gets and puts. So just notice that there's a difference in some of these fields, right? So you see byte sent and object size. So that's where an analyst can come in and see, okay, something's up. And then, this is just kind of highlighting why a public S3 bucket could be a big deal. That's just the same as having a public repo, right? You're going to have security concerns if something isn't closed off from the public. And then, so here we see another IP address that's actually trying to access that particular bucket. And so you see things like the object size, like I mentioned earlier, is different than the previous file that was part of, in this case, the get statement in the API request. So just, activity that we want to keep in mind. Alice needs to see what's happening in order to determine if something is malicious or not. So you're really just looking at the gets and the puts, and it seems malicious. Any questions? Yeah.
I know you didn't want to get too into the weeds on the semantics of the search.
We can.
Notice time specifically starting with underscore, whereas the rest didn't. My assumption there is that all of those other column headers, if you will, were extracted from the logs, whereas time is, I assume, protected these bits, or like what are the other Splunk specific data points that you can put in this other than time?
Yeah, so there's, first of all, there's like 3 different times in Splunk, so we always have to be careful. You mentioned underscore time. There's like index time, right? So that's a good question. So there's ways to even point at the data a little bit different than like time of the event, right? But the whole point of SPL is just like querying into different parts of the, scenario, right? So time is a big one. Location is another big one. So the workshop that we run is called Splunk for Rookies. It talks about like what you're asking about. It's like it goes through different scenarios where you're trying to use SPL. So one of the big ones. Time is like the biggest thing in Splunk because there's actually, I didn't get to go through it today because it's not part of this workshop. There's the types of search. There's fast, smart, and then it's like Splunk's verbose version. I forgot which one it's called, but it's like looking at different factors that you're talking about, right? So most of them take time into account, but it looks at the amount of data, right, that was ingested into maybe one index, for example, what makes it seem more of like an implication or not. So like when you go into near time picker, you see all the criteria, right? You see the different type of search, you see time, but the SPL is what's letting you pick that. You mentioned regular expressions earlier, right? So if you're looking at inventory for a lot of servers, you can put in criteria where it's like, okay, you're basically doing if then else's, right? Of, okay, when did this happen? What's the condition? But, as far as like, does it help answer your question? It's more of like what you're putting into the SPL, what your data is. If you look at AWS, for example, it could be, you have CloudTrail is something going over a threshold. So a lot of folks that use, Splunk Enterprise, like just from like an alerting perspective, it might not just be the time of it. Maybe, hey, this number of hosts went over X amount of attempts of logins, for example, and things like that. Yeah, and that's what the complicated searches do, even when it comes to like I mentioned the analytic stories. When you talk about AWS, it's just bringing in, there's a technical add-on for Splunk. It's bringing in all this information from the different services, but then it's like, okay, what do we do? It's like, okay, you have those researchers that are not necessarily writing the searches, but they're trying to figure out, okay, what can I detect from this data in AWS where it actually means something to me, right? Because, yeah, like you mentioned, it's just time, right? That's like, usually this is automated, where when we go through SOAR, you'll see like a playbook may just say, okay, this was run at like 2 p.m. If it was ran at 3 p.m., go turn off a whole firewall, go turn the firewall on or off, like, do something. So I think that's where SPL, like if you go to Splunk docs, like most things start referring back to SPL because it ends up being the core of the platform. Awesome. So now the last thing we're going to talk about is everything we did, how it can be done in an automated fashion. So I mentioned earlier SOAR, just so it's not confusing. In the environment you're playing around with, it's called Phantom. That was the whole brand name going forward. Now it's called SOAR. So it's the same thing, security orchestration, automation, right? But it's our automation platform. When we look at this scenario, we have all events that we've been working with the whole workshop, right? They're coming into Splunk. Splunk SOAR. So you have ES pushing in events to SOAR. I'll talk a little bit more about playbooks, but the whole concept is all these actions that we were taking, to be honest with you, SOAR is supposed to be automating those because you may have an SOP where you have, X metric. This is the platform that's going to start doing some of those manual actions through the form of Python code. But the product is now so advanced where I feel like most people don't even have to write Python. A lot of folks do because you can customize and start using a lot of APIs in a very customizable way, and you can start doing a lot around how it impacts your SOP. So that's what we're going through here, through this SOAR workshop. We'll have one quick exercise, but it's actually a pretty quick introduction. If you're more interested in doing a hands-on SOAR workshop, you can let one of us know at Splunk, and we actually run a whole workshop just on SOAR, where you go in and we talk about not just playbooks, we talk about doing stuff manually as an analyst there and just reviewing stuff. Then we go in and talk about workbooks, which is a little bit more of the process in your SOP. And then we talk about the actual playbooks, which are the blocks of where actual executions are being made within the security process, right? So I'll show you some examples of all this, but just wanted to kind of show you how we're tying in SOAR at the end here. So go ahead and hop into your SOAR environment. I know we haven't been in there yet, so same credentials, same username, password. Once you get here, you're going to see this layout that you've been seeing. Clicking that top left, all the way top left, will always get you home. But the most commonly used navigation button will be where you see home. Once you click that, you'll see a lot more. You'll see a drop-down, which will come up on this next slide here. Whoops. Once you click that, you'll get all these options, which, we won't play through all of these, but, everything's coming in as an event. You see cases, which are things that are escalated to from an event. Let's go ahead and click on sources now. That's actually, that's saying, hey, are we getting data from Palo Alto? Are we getting data from Splunk? Are we getting data from where? But once you're in sources, you're going to get this whole layout here where it's going to show you these. Of course, this is like Splunk, right? Field and value, but it's showing you the name of the event that came in from ES. Particular labels that could be useful later. Things like the owner, right? So all of you could be assigned to something, right? It'll say if a case is open, or excuse me, if an event is open, if it's been assigned, if it's a high or low, what the priority is. All that good stuff is given on this one screen, and then there's a ton of filters here, just like in the other products we've been using today, that you can go through and kind of filter on to see what's priority to you as an analyst. So this, I'm gonna give us 5 minutes because I know we're like right on time. I would say just play with Splunk here, or excuse me, play with SOAR. I'll walk around, and then we'll quickly go through it. There's not much to, you can't really break anything, like I said, but here you want to just search. Use Phantom to find the event that this is referencing, right? So bucket. You can identify its IP address, for example. You can see the different fields like city, rule, some of the rules that are in ES. So just like the automations, right? So just let's do like 2 to 3 minutes just so we have some time to talk about any questions you all have. Just see what you find there, and then we'll circle back, go through this together, and then wrap up with some questions. So you don't really have to do anything. We had some great proactive folks trying to like do some actions and stuff, but you were just trying to find some indicators about the event and see kind of what could be done. So let's talk about like just one example. This is our AWS scenario, right? We identified a public S3 bucket. We had this notable event that was created that came in from ES, right? So that notable event is now in ES for us to, it came from ES and now it's in SOAR for us to filter down on. So, typing bucket in is really what all you had to do on this. And then once you hit return or search, you would be left with just that single event, which is returning that public S3 bucket. Once you click that name, you're going to get this whole, I'm just going to explain this at a high level, but you get this whole analyst view where you get some of the details about the event, the dates, any people or details involved. But the big thing you want to click on is artifacts because that's everything that has implications from an S3 perspective. So go ahead and click on artifacts. And then you get a list of these artifacts, right? You want to kind of investigate into that. So you want to go ahead and click on the actual artifact itself. And in this case, you can go ahead and click on the only one you have available to you to see what you can do. And so clicking on that artifact really just does a little bit of an expansion here. So this can be a number of values, right? That can come across from enterprise securities, different notable events, but it gives you stuff to play with, right? And see what you can do from an analyst perspective, because you're still in manual mode here, right? So taking a closer, zoomed-in look at some of the detail, we can see the name of the search that generated that particular notable event. So that's stuff that matters to ES, not even really to SOAR right now, but we can see all this information, like the source address and all that stuff that's in Splunk right now. So if we want to take some automated action, though, we could easily do this from view. So at the top of the screen, click on the action button. So a pop-up window is going to appear, right? You see it like this with a bunch of different actions that you can take. Because we had a public S3 bucket created, perhaps we should do some enumeration for the other S3 buckets we have out there to see if they're public. So what you want to do is find list buckets on the list, and click on it. And once you do that, you're kind of just moving forward on what you have available to you. So you want to click on Frothley_investigator. And at this point, we want to launch the investigator, right, to list out our buckets, because that's all we're doing here for the enumeration, right? So go ahead and click launch. And at this point, you're going to get a result of the widget output, right? And on your left side is your activity pane. So everything you're doing in SOAR, you're going to get on the left side, right? That's like, call it your logs, but it's also just like, it's your guide, because you see, you executed an action, you know if it was executed or not. If it wasn't, you need to figure out why it's not working, right? Because you have actions, and then you have these different assets, or in this case, a bucket, right, that you want something executed against. That's your confirmation page on the left, so that's your buddy there. But yeah, here there's ways to mitigate risks with different S3 buckets, right? So right now we have a list of all our S3 buckets. So a way to remediate when it comes to access control, right, is using an ACL. So, there's always a root cause to every issue. So let's go back to the top of the screen and do another action, right? Because we see risk with, this is a public S3 bucket, right? So we see some risk and we want to take action. So let's go to the top of the screen and run another action. So click on the action button. We can scroll through the action type list until we find update ACL, right? Because that's what we're trying to do here. We're not trying to, close off a firewall or anything right now. So click on Frothley Investigator. That's the app that will be used to update the ACL, by the way, right? So I didn't really explain what Frothley Investigator is, but that's what we're using. So let's go ahead and click that. And because the bucket was exposed, the bucket that was exposed, right, it's called Frothley Web Code that we put in our search area, we need to specify that name in the bucket name text, right, in that box, so we know which bucket to apply this ACL to. And we can click on the drop down to set bucket ACL to authenticated, and then click launch to run the action. Now, in the activity pane, like I mentioned, on the left side of the screen, we can see the list button action and the update ACL. That was run, successfully. And then you see the widgets, right? That's also just giving confirmation in a prettier form. We see a success. So with these two actions, right, that we mentioned, we've been able to get that list, right? We enumerated the list, and then we took immediate action to correct by using an ACL. Now, just a few key things in Phantom. We're wrapping up here in another minute or two. If you go back to Phantom, the Phantom logo on the left, just so everyone's aware before we wrap up, when you go back, there's ways to navigate some useful resources once you start messing around with Phantom. You want to know how you can access things that can be reused or give you more information. So click on Home and then Apps. This will essentially, at a high level, just give you a list of all the apps. To tie this into everything we've been doing, we discussed a lot of stuff around what Alice Bluebird could do. A lot of these apps are what take action, right? The ACL, virus total gives us information around threats. We may want to shut down a firewall. We could have Palo Alto in there. We could have an endless amount of apps, right? So just keep that in mind. You can go there. You can have your custom apps. You can that's where you can build your own apps as well. So one of the last things I want to talk about is playbooks. So if you click into playbooks, that's where all the orchestration takes place, right? You have multiple tools that may be in need in the security operations environment. So this is where you can see the playbooks that are already available. You can add new playbooks, and you can customize playbooks, kind of like a copy and paste and tailor to your needs. So if you click playbooks there, in this scenario, you could click in and see this particular playbook, but I'll quickly explain, what a playbook looks like here. But I was talking about earlier, like your question about, what's the criteria of what needs to happen in a security operations environment. You're going to start somewhere. Each block is some type of criteria, and each of these could be a decision, right? Where a user gets prompt, an analyst could be prompted, hey, do I want this firewall turned off? Do I want a code repository updated? All that stuff is in the playbook, and at the back end, this is all Python code. So you can actually edit the Python through the playbook editor. This debugger is going to show you if the playbook is executing correctly as you're testing, right? So a lot of capability here, but all the stuff that we did today can just be automated in SOAR. Because, for example, you have an event from ES, it can trigger up to Splunk and say, hey, this threshold was met. What needs to be done from a user perspective, and it goes on and on. So we have a whole workshop designed around SOAR, right? So I could go pretty deep on this, but at a high level, a playbook it's the actual actions. Like we went in and did some of these actions. They can be automated within a playbook itself. So that being said, we're going to wrap up here. We went through ES, UBA, and Phantom mainly. If you have questions, I put my email at the front. I can also provide it for anyone that didn't get it. But this was just one of many workshops that we run. So if you have questions, or if you feel like you could get more value out of using some of the data sets we use today, this is running 24/7. So if you go to that link, it's just a public link. You log in with a Splunk account. You can actually get access to all these data sets and run through these CTF events. So that's there 24/7, right? So it's a good opportunity if you're trying to learn more like you did today and kind of mess around with the environment. And this is just a list of the other workshops we offer. This was, like I said, one of many. We run a ton of security workshops. If you have questions, you can email me or email whoever your Splunk contact is. And then if you get a chance, we have a survey if you go into the ES environment, there's a link to it, so you don't have to copy it from here. We'd really appreciate if you do get feedback on the content itself, how it was delivered, things like that. But that being said, I'll wrap it up for the workshop itself. Whoever has questions, I'll be around for another 20 minutes. We can chat. I do have the instances running until tomorrow, so the environment you were in, just keep your credentials. You can play around with it. There's a lot that we just don't cover in this workshop that you can see in there. But that being said, thank you, and appreciate everyone's time.